Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this important discussion about a very important topic. The timing is excellent for a robust discussion about this debate. My name is Nick Binedell, and I've been asked to chair this session. It's a pleasure for me to welcome the panel, and I'm going to do so from my left. Maletsi Mbeki, a well-known analyst and business person. Prof Mayer, well known to all as a political commentator and engaged in political life. Tera Lokota, Mosiwa Lokota, who is a member of Parliament and the leader of COPE. John Steenhuisen, who's the Chief Whip of the DA, and Kali Kriel from AfriForum. Please join me in giving them a very warm welcome. We've asked the panel to share a few thoughts to kick off the discussion, and then I'll talk to them a little bit, and they may talk to each other, and then we're going to open up to you in the audience. So let me start, if I can, with John Steenhuisen, maybe just to outline from your point of view how you see this issue of the political dynamics of South Africa and the farming and land question. We're entering a very interesting period. I'm sure there are many topics that are going to come up. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick, and it's great to be with you and great to be here for this very important discussion, which I think the nation should be engaged with as we move forward. I think that we have to start off from the point that the agricultural sector particularly has taken a massive battering over the course of the last decade. I mean, it's been beset by droughts, massive unemployment within the sector, drop-offs of imports, and a real difficult environment for those agricultural practitioners to get on and do their job. And unfortunately, that's been exacerbated by, I think, very poor policy implementation by government. It's been exacerbated by an absolute policy schizophrenia in the government space, where it's created a massive sense of uncertainty that was massively accelerated over the course of the last 5 years and in the last few years of the Zuma presidency particularly. And I think that a lot of people were looking greatly forward when the Zuma era drew to an end and that chapter closed, that we would start to see a little bit more certainty in a variety of sectors, most particularly this agricultural sector, because I think there's a lot of people who are holding off on investment. They're in a holding pattern, both internationally and locally, looking for some certainty about what government's approach is and where it's heading. They don't think they mind risk. I don't think any investor is worried about risk, but it's the uncertainty that's a major deterrent to job creation. As a result, we've actually shed massive jobs in the agricultural sector. Agricultural employment in South Africa accounts for only 5% of employment. This is way below the average of other developing countries who have a burgeoning agricultural sector. And so I think that many people were very excited when the new president was sworn in and thought here we would have a chance now to be able to start pegging down some certainty, start removing some of this unsurety that exists in the political space. But unfortunately, one of the first opening acts of this presidency has been opening up this whole issue of expropriation without compensation. And I think it's really created a renewed sense of uncertainty, of fear on some parts, and I think has opened up an emotional debate in South Africa, which I think it's important for us to have, but it mustn't come at the cost of the future economic viability of South Africa, particularly as it relates to agricultural employment. And I think that there's nobody in this room or in this panel who could deny the fact that this country has been beset by decades upon decades of legislative dispossession, particularly of black South Africans, of land. And that has resulted in skewed ownership patterns in South Africa. And I think that as South Africans across the board, no matter what our political persuasion is, we must be working every day to build that bridge to bridge that divide and redress those imbalances. And this dates back from the Glenn Gray Act to the Pegging Act to the 1913 Land Act to the Group Areas Act. It's legislative dispossession. And so we should be using legislative means to ensure that we have restitution and redistribution in South Africa. But what makes me very disappointed is the fact that the Constitution is now being scapegoated as the reason why land reform has not worked in South Africa. And let's be honest, it has not worked. We still have these skewed ownership patterns. We still have people who are waiting for restitution claims that have never been processed. We're processing like 500 a year. It's going to take us 35 years to just get through the current backlog of restitution claims that have been submitted. But I really don't like the way that Section 25 of the Constitution is being set up as this hurdle that has prevented land reform. And if anyone reads Section 25, it does precisely the opposite. It sets out very clearly that the state must, not may, not should, not perhaps when the time is right, embark upon a process of ensuring equitable access to land for all South Africans and ensuring restitution. It directs South Africa and our government to, in fact, pass legislation that ensures that. It is also not an impediment to do the types of public interest expropriation that the government says it's been unable to do. And I think that the words of Justice Moseneke in this, when he addressed a conference during the course of last year, that says in the last 20 years, the courts have not been asked to adjudicate once on an expropriation case that has been in the public interest. So it's clear to me that what's happening here is the Constitution is being scapegoated as an excuse to cover up for a decade's worth, 2 decades worth of policy failure, of legislation failure. And this is borne out as well, not by anyone less significant than the former President of the Republic of South Africa, Kgalema Motlanthe, in the high-level panel report that was tabled last year, which said that quite the opposite is true, that the real impediments to land reform in South Africa is not Section 25 of the Constitution. In fact, those impediments, and they highlight 3 of them: lack of a government putting its money where its mouth is. In the last financial year, 0.2% of national expenditure spent on land reform. That's not putting your money where its mouth is. And to add insult to injury, the government spent more on VIP protection services for the cabinet than it did on land reform in that last budget. And I think that says something about the priorities. The second thing it talks about is elite capture. So I think a very polite academic way of talking about corruption and maladministration. And I think the Estina dairy farm is a very good example of that. And then thirdly, it says there's incoherent legislative environment for meaningful land reform to take place quickly and efficiently. And so I think we should heed those warnings of the high-level panel and start moving towards getting to the real nub of the problem instead of scapegoating the property clause in the Constitution, which really underpins private property ownership in South Africa. And this is the other thing that concerns me, is I think there's many South Africans in urban areas who think this is a problem for farmers and for agricultural areas. It absolutely is not, because that is not the land clause, it's the property clause. And once you allow for expropriation without compensation within that clause, you open up a whole can of worms that I don't think we should be doing, particularly if we need to be attracting the type of international investment that we want, and we're wanting local investors to start having confidence in South Africa, to be able to peg their investment down here, so we can start moving this country forward again. We can do better as a nation, we can do better as a country, and I think we can get a lot better as a government in terms of ensuring land reform.
Thanks very much, John. You're the Chief Whip of the DA. What is the likely mandate to the all-parliamentary committee that the DA will be putting forward?
Well, obviously, we'll be demonstrating very clearly how the Constitution is not the impediment. We'll be pulling out the testimony that was given to the high-level panel report. We'll be looking at the complete absence of jurisprudence within that space and putting it very clearly before the committee and making the rational argument that the Constitution is not the impediment. We must start from the point that we need to have land reform in South Africa. There needs to be restitution. But the unintended consequences of the constitutional tampering, I think, will be too devastating for our economy and for food security and the sustainability and employability within the agricultural sector that, ironically, the President in his maiden State of the Nation address said he wanted to see happening.
Thanks very much, John. Moletsi, let me turn to you to maybe comment on what John said, but you're a person who's had a long experience of analysing South Africa, its rural communities. What are your primary thoughts?
Well, my primary thought is I am totally unworried about the ANC and the EFF's propaganda on expropriation of land with or without compensation. In fact, at the end of last year, my company, I have a partnership with a family in the Eastern Free State, Johan Cronje's family. And last year, at the end of last year, we bought 2 farms. We were leasing a farm, and we bought 2 other farms. We raised cattle and sheep on our farms. So we're not in the least worried about the noise that is being made about the expropriation of land without compensation. It's got nothing to do with land. It's about the ANC losing the elections. But before I go there, let me just say that the only thing that I have to thank the National Party for was sending me to exile. Because having been forced to exile, I learned so much about the rest of the world and about how societies developed. I spent the 1980s as a journalist in Zimbabwe, and I covered the whole land resettlement issue in Zimbabwe, which was an agreement between the nationalist organizations, the African nationalists, and the British government on how to manage and how to help landless peasants. And they had a resettlement program which went very, very well in Zimbabwe in the 80s until the politicians started to take the land instead of the land going to the landless peasants. And as we know, that ended up in a disaster. The ANC knows all about that. We had a very active ANC office in Zimbabwe, so they know that story. No, this is not about land. It is about the loss of votes by the ANC. And the ANC and its little son, the economic freedom fighters, the little baby, they think they can bring back the voters who are abandoning the ANC by attacking the white population. That's what this is about. So it's an attack on the white citizens of South Africa, on the white population. They're not going to do anything about the land, but they're using this as a camouflage to attack the white population.
So you see it primarily as a electoral campaigning and the complexities within the ANC?
If you look at what has been happening to the ANC vote, the ANC was at nearly 70% of the electorate. In the last general election in 2014, it went down to 62. And in the local government election, it lost the major metros, lost control of the major metros. So the ANC, like we all can see, is losing votes. So the ANC is asking itself, how do we get the voters who are abandoning us, either by staying at home or voting for the opposition parties? Now, its solution to this is to attack the white population. That's how it sees as a tactic. It is supported and reinforced by, of course, the famous black racist, which is Mr. Malema, who is very eloquent. So Malema is actually now leading the ANC's election campaign by attacking the white population. Personally, I know the ANC is totally mistaken. The black consciousness parties like AZAPO and the PAC have never attracted the attention of the black voters. Black voters in South Africa are very economically literate. They are not interested in race issues. They are interested in what is happening in the economy. And the reason why they are abandoning the ANC and why the EFF is only a 6% vote party is precisely because their economic policies, the ANC's economic policies have failed. And the people can see their economic policies. They're in a deadlock in terms of its economic policies. In fact, the ANC's economic policies have led to the deindustrialization of South Africa. In the 1980s, manufacturing was like nearly a quarter of our gross domestic product. It was nearly 25% of the GDP of South Africa. Today, it's only 13% of the GDP of South Africa. And we've lost huge number of jobs in the manufacturing sector. So that is what's called failure of policy. And the South African voters can see this. That's why they are abandoning the vote. So the ANC thinks that by using the white population as a scapegoat, it will persuade the black voters, who are abandoning it in droves, to come back and vote for it. It's not going to work. There will be more and more shrill. And my position, my advice to the white population and to the farming population is ignore these guys. This is all noise. It will lead nowhere.
So we can cut the debate short now.
Oh, absolutely.
Cully,
Can we have some whiskey and brandy, please?
Good idea.
Kali, you have raised headlines, eyebrows, and blood pressure in the last short while. Would you like to comment on what you've heard and share your point of view with us?
Yes. Firstly, the reason why we've taken this issue seriously is because we see agriculture as a very important sector in terms of job creation, food security, and of course as well, it's one of the few sectors that have had a growing contribution to the GDP. So that is something that we need to protect at all costs. And I really wished that I shared Mr. Mbeki's optimism. It would also be nice for me to rather drink a whiskey and think the whole thing would disappear. But we've also heard this story before. Over the last 8 years, AfriForum has supported Zimbabwean farmers. We helped them to register a SADC tribunal ruling in South Africa. And in the end, we were able to attach a Zimbabwean property and sell it off at an auction. Of course, the money was not enough to compensate them, but at least it was a symbolic thing that happened. But in our discussions with them, we asked them on numerous occasions where we had these discussions, what would you change if you could go back to the beginning of the process in Zimbabwe? And the one thing is that they said, they had the belief that Mr. Mbeki has, is that don't worry, this is only political speak. The Zimbabwean president, Mr. Mugabe's elections or support of his party was under pressure, and everybody said this is simply to get some more votes, so don't worry, just lie low and say nothing. And unfortunately, the result of that attitude is there for all of us to see. So our view is to say, let's look at the reality. At the moment, there's an official ANC policy. It's not a discussion paper. It's a policy that they accepted in December at their national conference, saying this is our policy to expropriate without compensation. And there are numerous video clips of the current president saying, we are going to give the land to our people. And of course, he excludes someone like me from his our people, but that's another debate. But he says, we are going to expropriate the land without compensation to give it to our people. So he says it clearly. So if we are not going to take this seriously, we should say, oh no, the president is just lying and nothing will happen. There's reason for us to take this seriously, not to be alarmist, but to take it seriously and say, what can we do to stop this from going ahead? If we're just going to are we going to sit back and hope for the best? I don't believe that's the right way to go about it. We must do something. And that is why we said, we have had lots of experiences over the last few decades with the ANC. I'll admit it, here we had 8 meetings with President Zuma. And during all those meetings, big promises were made, but in the end, we got 0 from it. And it's simply because it's nice talk. The only places where we achieved something in municipalities to get concessions on the shooting of Kill the Boer song and so forth, where we had some kind of mechanism to put pressure on the ruling party. And that is why we are going overseas. And we have a problem. Unfortunately, the current president says you have these people going overseas to mobilize against their own country. But that statement is part of the confusion that we see in the country between what is the state and the country's interests and what are the interests of the ruling party. And there's a difference between those. If you're going to say we want to promote expropriation without compensation, you are actually acting against the interests of the country as we see it. And to go elsewhere and put pressure to stop us having a Zimbabwe or a Venezuela or a Cuba, that is indeed a deed of patriotism. So, of course, there will be people that blood pressure rises, but so be it. We believe we're acting in the interest of the country. Why is property rights so important to us? you know, you'll get the accusations you only want to protect the so-called white farmers. There's nothing wrong to also protect those people, but that's not the only reason. The reason is we know that the economy will be destroyed if this happens. Also, in terms of land reform, will not be successful, and we're seeing it at the moment. If you go and look at the facts of the farms that were bought, 4,000 farms were bought. The government paid 45 billion rand for those farms, but only 6% of those farms that were bought, people got title deeds. The rest is in state hands. And then the state tells us, we want to redistribute land to our people, but that's a big lie. It's nationalization. If you buy the land and you don't give it to people and you keep it in the state's hands. And then, of course, those people that live on that land are set up for failure. The agricultural people will know much better than I do, but if you don't have a title deed, you're not going to get funding. You're not going to have a successful farm. So it's a threat also to food security if you're going to have a program that is actually a nationalization under the guise of redistribution. I can also say the government tries to justify what they want to do now, and of course it is justified to say we need successful black farmers. That is something I think everybody supports that happens. But they are trying to justify these radical measures by holding out false statistics to the people in this country. If you are going to look at the statistics, you would hear the president said, well, whites have 72% of the land in the country. But for a normal person out there hearing this, he thinks, well, they've got the whole country. But the reality is that is 72% of 30%, which means that white farmers actually own 22% approximately of the land. The government owns 30%. So this is very much also a political process or a political game that's being played. Try and create some scapegoat. If you have the scapegoat, drive in your radical programs in order to get support. So I agree with Mr. Mbeki that it is to get support, but the problem is they might go ahead with the program to make sure that that support they get is bigger. Then, of course, there's a question, is there a real hunger for land? And we're not insensitive to the fact that there are many black people in this country that would want to have access to land. But that is also many times exaggerated because the real hunger for land is in urban areas. If you look at the 80,000 land claims that were lodged in 1998, 57% of those land claims were in urban areas. And then the claims that were successful, 93% of the people that were successful said, we would rather have the cash and not the land. So that is also something that we must keep in mind. So there's a balancing act needed, which does not include expropriation without compensation. It is a balancing act built on property rights and with development of farmers that can have access to capital through title deeds.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask you, the President also said there are two caveats, two conditions. The one is the protection of food security, and the other is damage to the economy. Do you not see those, do you not take them as read into the way forward?
Well, it would be the same for me saying, you know, I'm going to shoot you, but I'm going to make sure it doesn't hurt you. Those caveats can't be used in the same sentence as expropriation without compensation. So there should be clarity. And I think the uncertainty John spoke about is a big problem, because you can't say, well, we'll do this, but maybe not in these circumstances. Come to the fore and say what is the plan, because there are people now at the moment not investing in agriculture simply because of the uncertainty.
Thank you very much. Let me come to Mr. Lokota, who hails from this province, as I understand. He's had many years in Parliament and in government. What is your take on this?
Well, the first point I'd like to make is that I share the optimism of Mr. Mbeki. And I've got a good reason. Unlike himself, I was lucky not to go to exile. I was lucky to be taken to Robben Island periodically to spend some time and then come back and go back there again. So our fortunes were different in that regard. But the reason I share it is because I'm one of the few South Africans probably who do not subscribe to what people call the Mandela magic. Whilst President Mandela and many other comrades, some on Robben Island, others in exile, before they left, our people went to a congress in Kliptown, and they had to decide what South Africa they wanted for the future. And then they said, we want a South Africa that belongs to all who live in it, black and white. Then a few years later, President Mandela and them went to Robben Island, others went to exile. In all of that time, the majority of the people of our country continued to subscribe to the idea we want a South Africa that belongs to all who live in it, black and white. So when we went to CODESA, the majority of us who were there representing the people of this country were able to write a constitution that could say, we believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. I'm quite sure that majority has not yet changed, and that's why I share his optimism. And I want to appeal to all of you, my dear country, men and women. We must stop being seized with the mentality of apartheid. The future is non-racial, where we are going. And the reasons for this are plenty. Let me say to you first and foremost, South Africans, you are no longer Dutch. I used to be a Mosotho living under the rule of Moshoeshoe the first and other kings. The people of Botswana used to live under, well, let me not say over, Botswana used to live under a king of Botswana. The majority of Botswana today are in South Africa. The majority of Basotho are in South Africa. The majority of Amaswazi are in South Africa. We no longer live in those tribal states, if I may so say, that were there before the advent of other people. The Dutch who came here no longer live under, no longer even have citizenship of the Netherlands, and I can go on. The Filipino slaves, the Malay slaves, the Indian indentured laborers. We are a modern national state called South Africa. The boundaries that we are in were the boundaries imposed on us by the British when in 1910 they declared South Africa a union of South Africa and left us there and went. The outer boundaries are that we are a modern national state. I can no longer claim to be better than you, my friend. And Mr. Mbeki cannot claim to be better than Rulfi. We are all citizens of one country. We can't represent Lesotho. We can't represent Botswana. We can't go to the Olympic Games and represent Basotho land or Zululand or Bechuana land or Swaziland. We can only go to represent one country, the Republic of South Africa. Not only did the boundaries change in terms of composition as human beings, we now have people in this country that were not there in the 1400s or even 1600s. People called colored. Which country did they come from? And who colored who? We are not the people we were at the beginning of the history that makes this country. That is why at CODESA, when we declared that South Africa is one democratic, that republic, essentially we said, whether I was born in Kwakwa or not, if I went to Prof Ader and I wanted to stay there, I have a right to stay there. If you are born in Gazankulu and you want to stay in any other part of the country, you may stay there. Because this is a new modern national state. In international law, the country called Lesotho is recognized within the borders that you call Lesotho. Bechuanaland is no longer there, it's now Botswana. Is it that? And so on. So what does that say to us? The Constitution is right when it says there's a common South African citizenship. And since that is so, Mwelezi Mbeki is correct when he says, I'm not worried about these guys. I'm busy doing my business there. The great-grandchildren of the Indian indentured laborers who came here, today, generations on, they cannot even tell you which part of India they came from. The Malay slaves who now passed into history left their seats here. Their great-grandchildren are here. All they know is South Africa. We will not and we must not continue to think in these terms. I am white. I am black. Look, there are white horses. There are black horses. There are gray horses. There are red horses, whatever you like. All of them are horses. We are South Africans. Whether you like it or not, we are South Africans. And look at our complexions. Please do. My surname is a Sesotho surname. Some of the leaders of our movement I know, whose fathers were white, whose mothers were Tswana, or Xhosa, or what. Some of the leaders of our country. Why do you call them white? Why do you call them black? Why don't you call them South Africans? And what is the difference other than that? They may speak that language and this language. So I'm sorry. Let's come out of this and say this. Through history, this country has evolved. As early as 1908, 1909, the convention preparing for the Union of South Africa, our leaders, our forebears, black and white, argued about whether we should accept union or not. The black sections of the population, including people like Abdurrahman of Apo, including people like Pixley Kaseme and many others that were there at the time. In the petitions, in the documents they wrote, they spoke not of South Africa of so many people. They said, we want to have equal rights in the union. Don't give us union status without giving us equal rights. I look at their documents, I look at the petitions they wrote in the 20s, in the 30s, and all of that. Long before we came around, they were the ones who declared that we don't want the Calabar. They were the ones who declared in 55, we want a South Africa that belongs to all who live in it, black and white. What drove them to those conclusions? We don't even recognize the fact that one of the greatest contributors to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a South African, Jan Smuts. Where did he learn that from? Because he had no other home country except South Africa. He had grown up in this Commonwealth that we are. So therefore I say this. The majority of the people of our country will continue to support the constitution that was drafted at Kodesa. That constitution is our future. What we need to go is to move out of here and educate everybody that the future is non-racial, that we led in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that in implementing our constitution, we will be giving the world the most practical example of how the world of the future looks like. If the Brazilians can live in peace as they do, in spite of the variegated colors and complexions and all of that, there's no reason why we cannot do that in this country.
Thank you very much.
My privilege.
Rolf, Masuwa has painted, and have others, as the constitution as a bedrock, and that we're a modern state and we are a democracy, and we change presidents without major drama. So we have built this, we've made this constitution alive. But there are very practical issues. So let's go back to where we started and say, how do you see the process of this to deal with the past unfolding? We have a major backlog. We have, I agree with the optimism expressed, but it can't stop there. We have a lot of people who are angered, who are frustrated, who are fearful. How do you see this practicality flowing in the future?
Nick, I will try to come to that question. But can I just say firstly something about agriculture? We are here at the biggest agricultural show probably in the Southern Hemisphere, so we have to talk about that too. And my point of view is that we are probably in the best position from the sector, speaking from the sector, agricultural sector in general, that we have been in a very long time. I think there's a window of opportunity for agriculture in this country, because it's being recognized as one of the 5 sectors that need to contribute to the general GDP of the country and the growth of the country. The government has said that. I think everyone here would agree to that as well. The 5 sectors being manufacturing in general, secondly, the motor manufacturing industry, thirdly, mining or mineral resources, the 4th one is tourism, and 5thly, agriculture. And I think that, given the fact that that is the situation, we have a huge drive behind us to make it successful. And unfortunately, we had some good production years over the last 2 years that make that attractive, also from a government angle. And we must keep on pushing. We must keep on pushing as far as affordable financing is concerned, and we must keep on pushing as far as the training and the skills transfer for young and new farmers are concerned. So as far as agriculture is concerned, I want to put forward a positive picture and a window of opportunity that I feel very positive about, analyzing everything that is at stake. On the subject of your question about the Constitution, which involves the land debate, I firstly want to say that in as much as Moletsi might be right on the political analysis, I don't think the land issue will go away. It will not go away before this coming election next year or thereafter. Simply because I think land is being used in the debate, and probably rightfully so, as the subject of frustration about the level of inequality that we have in South Africa. And as long as inequality exists, the land issue is going to be part of the debate. We can't avoid that. You and I were this last week part of a discussion where it became very clear that on the one side there is the human right factor in the debate, the human dignity factor about land. And on the other side there are arguments, valid arguments, about the availability of farms that can be transferred to people who want to farm. 4,000, in fact, of them sitting in the hands of the state. Those two factors exist. Human dignity on the one side and tangible solutions on the other side. The question is, how do we bring about a balance? And I think all of us who are sitting here can make a contribution. Each of us can make a contribution in forwarding this debate towards a balanced picture. I think key elements of what is at stake have been raised. Firstly, personally, I'm in favor of retaining Section 25 as it is in the Constitution. I can't see why it needs to be changed. I think John was absolutely right, but he's not the only one, and he's not the only party that says that. The ANC themselves have said it very clearly. I had a discussion the other day with Jeremy Cronin, who, as far as I know, is the chair of the Expropriation Bill Committee in Parliament. And that's his view. One of the reasons why we should keep Section 25 as it is, which is now the one for debate, the reason why I personally would argue that it should stay like it is, it's because it's part of Chapter 2 of the Constitution, which deals with the Bill of Rights. And if you start to tamper on Section 25, you're not going to stop tampering with the rest. And Chapter 2 essentially guarantees the rights for all of us as individuals in this country. So my point is, let's keep it as it is. There are ways to deal with the land issue within Section 25, but also going beyond that if necessary. So that is the first part. The second part of the argument from my side is what Terror said is absolutely right in terms of where the whole notion of South Africa belongs to all of them, or all of us who live in it, has also been retained in the Constitution itself. Chapter 1 speaks to that very clearly. So all of us have the right under the same Constitution to be protected and guarded by the Constitutional Court. The last point I want to make is that, you know, prior to the transition, I'm talking about 1994, during that transition and thereafter, there was a body of middle ground that held us together. And it was represented in all the parties that participated in the process. Of course, there were the fringes on the right and the left who not necessarily agreed. But it was the center who held us together. And let me be frank about it. I think for a period of time during the last 10 years, we lost the center. I think we said it last year during our discussions here at the same event, that the center got scattered all over the place. And that is why we missed so many targets during the last 10 years. I think we are starting to potentially get back there. And I think it's part of our process that we have to focus on now, is to also focus the land debate towards getting answers in the center, because that can potentially produce the answers for all of us, and also contribute towards closing the inequality gap that exists. But the point is, this argument about, or the debate about land is not going to go away. I don't think so. I think Moletsi is not right in that respect, because it's linked to the whole question of inequality that exists in South Africa.
So practically then, let me ask any member of the panel to respond. Practically then, we're acknowledging that although there's been change, there's not been enough change in this particular sector, and the rate of change needs to be accelerated. Certainly, I think most of us would say there's a younger generation that is pushing for more substance. Most people would say the state is not doing what it could do to accelerate this transformation. And some people would ask the sector what its plan is to contribute as producers, as you say, in a very productive sector of our economy. How will we all do more to make this further steps come to life? What are some of the practicalities then? I think we've had a good discussion at a high level, But I think you know, to some degree the building is on fire. People are agitated and restless. I buy your point about the politics of it, but what are some of the practical things to accelerate this that we see? I'm going to take three quick comments, 1, 2, and 3, and 4.
Well, the first point I'd like to make is, I do want to insist that I think Melez is right. Well, he's addressed the question of rural land, and I won't talk to that. Section 26 of the Constitution, because the biggest problem at the moment is all these people that are sitting in shacks in the fringes of towns and cities. And that is provided for in Section 26 of the Constitution. Everyone has the right to land, and the state is empowered to expropriate land, zone it for residential purposes, put in necessary infrastructure, and let the people, give the people title, let them build and stay and so on. If you don't do that, because they are there in big numbers, there will be this invasion of properties of individuals. We need a government and local government that's going to boldly go and take money that's available. Zone that land, the budgets that we send to local government, budget that land, expropriate with compensation, put the people in those things and so on. Please, you will not have another problem tomorrow. So that is the first point that I add to what has already been said on the countryside. The second point is education. We must get government that is going to prioritize application of Section 29 of the Constitution, education for both young and old. If there's elderly people that want to get some training quickly to go and farm, give it to them. But don't give somebody land that doesn't know what to do with it. All these young people that want to go to universities and so on, we must reopen land. We must reopen all the training colleges where our young people used to get training for agricultural work and so on. Once it's like that, we can then, the 400 farms or so that 4,000 farms that Rolf is talking about, we make this available to them. But don't give it to them if they don't have a capacity to work it.
It seems so obvious. Why haven't we done it?
Because of the Guptas. Because of Zuma. Because of Mahashule. Because of Supra. Honestly, it's not the Constitution. It is these elements that seized the state and drove people that wanted to do the right thing. And then they did what they did. Now we are deeper in debt than we were when we took over from the National Party.
John.
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of things that need to be done. I mean, first of all, we've got to actually have an understanding of what land is available and what's out there. I think there's consensus that this latest land audit is wholly insufficient. It doesn't have a handle. Government itself doesn't even know what land is in its possession. I think we should start off by looking at what unused state-owned land, both urban and rural environments, exists, and looking at parceling that up and ensuring it's given to beneficiaries and they are given title for that land. Because you can't have a situation like these poor people on the 4,900 farms that Rolf speaks about, and in these tribal trust areas, who are reduced to a sense of feudalism, of serfdom, on land where they work that doesn't belong to them. So we've got to put title into the hands of more South Africans, so they have a stake not only in the country, but in the economy, and they have an asset they can leverage. We then also need to ensure that we speed up the land restitution backlog. It is a source of great anger and frustration amongst those people who have been waiting essentially 2 decades now for restitution claims to be resolved. We must put the budget towards it, and we must ensure that that restitution takes place. And then we must look where we do government projects, whether it's housing projects or land reform projects, that the title deeds are handed over virtually immediately. Because I get the sense that, I mean, the EFF are explicit about it. They don't believe anyone should own private land, whether you're black, white, Indian or coloured. But the EFF are more subtle, the ANC are more subtle about it, which is why you sit with these 4,900 farms that are simply not handed over. So we've got to get serious about giving black South Africans particularly title. And then I think we've got to have a much better partnership between government and commercial agriculture. Government must not see commercial agriculture as the bogeyman and the enemy. Organizations like those who are hosting Nampo, Grain SA, and others are doing incredible work, far more than government actually, in empowering emerging black farmers to be able to be successful and viable farmers. And government must not treat commercial agriculture as enemy. It must treat it as a partner. And if you're in a marriage and a partnership, you need to listen to each other. You may not always agree, but what you can't end up doing is, is forcing one individual out of the house. Without that partnership, I think we're going to have problems going forward.
Kali, a second, and then Maletsi, and then we're going to open up to the audience.
Yes, thank you, Nick. I want to agree with Mr. Lakota. I hope I'm not giving you a kiss of death by, by agreeing with you. But he mentioned education, and I don't think it's not only education in the agricultural sector, but if you are going to look at solving our problems in the country, all these measures will fail if you don't have people that are empowered to make use of the opportunities. And I think the major issue in this country is we should look at the 80% schools that are dysfunctional at the moment, where there are teachers not pitching up at school, where you have a trade union that stops government from bringing discipline. It sounds as if it's far from agriculture, but if you have a strongly equipped, empowered young people, then these measures will succeed. As long as you don't have that, most measures will fail because people don't necessarily have the skills to make use of it. And then shortly, the second point is, I believe, title deeds. And it's not only with regard to land. I think many people feel disenfranchised, but if you have a RDP house, there's no reason why there should not be title deeds on those. And I think if you first have a title deed on your house, you will have access to capital. It gives you an opportunity to improve your own environment. We believe in the concept of self-sufficiency, not government that has to do everything for everybody. But what government can do is through title deeds empower people to improve their own situation.
Maletsi, you started part of this conversation very optimistic. Give us some practical things you think should be done.
I have actually put some very practical things to the executive of Agri SA. And they have failed, Agri SA, to follow up on the practical things. So now we're panicking. 3 or 4 years ago, every 2nd of February, the FW de Klerk Foundation holds a conference on one issue or another. 3 years ago, I think it's 3 years, they held a conference on the theme of land reform. And I was one of the panelists in that. And I said to Agri SA, they were there represented by their hoi polloi, the first casualty of what Mugabe did with the commercial farms were the farm workers. They were the primary casualties. People think that Mugabe expropriated the land from the commercial farmers because he hated white people or because he, rather like the debate, the so-called discussion we're having, it wasn't because of, it's because the commercial farmers supported the farm workers to go and vote. They provided their trucks, their tractors, and so on. And who did the farm workers vote for? They voted for MDC, for the opposition. So the reason why the land was taken from the farmers in Zimbabwe was to destroy the constituency base of the farm workers. It had nothing to do with equality or inequality about land distribution. So it's a political issue. Now you fight political issues politically. So I said to Agri SA 3-4 years ago, you go and sit down with COSATU and I will arrange the meeting. And you discuss how to fight the madness that is going on, even at that time, about land reform. Because you have a common interest, you, the farmers, and you, the unions, because your members are the ones who are going to be kicked out of those farms. So everybody laughed at me saying, well, this is crazy. You know, can you imagine the executives of Agri SA sitting down, going to COSATU House in Braamfontein? Well, And the CEO at the time of Agri-SA, he was there at the meeting. He told me, you will never convince my members to do what you're saying. So I said, okay, I will come and make a presentation to the executive committee in Centurion, and I went. Eventually, there was a meeting of the whole executive of Agri-SA at COSATU House with the executive of COSATU chaired by Vavi on one side, and I think the gentleman's name was Mula, who was the president of Agri-SA. We had a very long meeting to establish what were the common interests between COSATU and Agri-SA. Now, Agri-SA didn't follow up after that. So that whole initiative came to nothing. Well, it's not too late. We can repeat the same thing. You have, democracy is about numbers. The 35 or 37,000 farmers that we have in South Africa, whether black or white, for them to think they can fight the ANC with 11 million voters, well, you can't win. But if you go to the workers, to the farm workers, to their representatives, to people like Vavi, then you get the millions on your side too, who have an interest in combating this nonsense that's going on in the country. So there is lots of practical things that you can do. Vavi is still there, okay? He has another federation. But all of you who are here can go and sit down with Vavi again. The South African Food and Allied Workers Union is a member of Vavi's union, this South African, SAFTU. They are the main organizer in the commercial farming sector. Sit down with them and work out how do you combat the propaganda that is happening in the country. But if you think you're going to produce statistics about agricultural output, product, these guys are not interested. That's not the issue. The issue, they know perfectly well. Cyril knows perfectly well, which is why he says it must not impact on food security. The ANC says so. It's not about agriculture. It's about using the white people as scapegoats. And you have to fight that. But you can't fight it by agricultural statistics. You have to fight it politically. We have the second largest party in South Africa. They sat with the Food and Allied Workers Union to discuss this issue of land? John is here. But if they're not going to sit with the farmers and the farm workers and discuss this issue, how are they going to win the fight? How are they going to win the propaganda fight? The chief of propaganda of the Nazis said, when you tell a lie, it must be a very big lie. Now, expropriation of land without is a very big lie. And people start talking about the lie and start believing in the lie. They still believe, even those who don't believe it, they think it has merit, so we must engage with it. It has no merit, but we must organize and oppose it.
Lovely, thank you. Can we thank the panel for their inputs? So I'm now going to open it up to the floor for comments. Please just say your name and try and keep your questions short. And what I'm going to suggest, just to help us through, is I'm going to take three at a time. So I see one at the back. That gentleman, just raise your hand, please. Yes, you in the team. That's one. And another. Somebody else? In the front row here. And one more customer. A lady over there. Thank you very much. Please just say your name and pose your question either to the panel. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. We'll come to you second. So I've got four. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'm Christo van der Rede. I'm from Agri-SA. I'm a bit disappointed. I think the discussion is quite frivolous, and I don't think any of the gentlemen sitting there in front has the faintest idea of actually what is happening within the circles of organized agriculture, within the circles of the commodities, in terms of our engagements with government. Land is a very emotive issue. We cannot just solve the issue of land with generalizations and all kinds of statements. And I don't think you have the faintest idea of what the commodities are currently doing at this point in time. More than 100,000 black farmers are part of the commodity structures. Black farmers in the Eastern Cape, more than 4,000 of them, are exporting their wool to China. With whose assistance? With Wool SA. Grain farmers all over South Africa, especially black farmers, are part of Grain SA. And they are already part of the value chain. They're doing, or their output is significant. Organized agriculture were part of the Phakisa process. I don't think anyone here actually knows what happened during the Phakisa process, where we came up with 27 initiatives. There we sat with Kusatu, with the new union SAFTU. All of those people sat there. We came up with brilliant concepts that can turn agriculture upside down. Our biggest challenge at this point in time is obviously a political challenge. We engage with departments like DAF, Department of Rural Development, Land Reform, and you sit there with people that are not very knowledgeable, not very committed, and people that are too scared to really implement what they're supposed to implement. So we sit with a political problem. With the willingness on the side of organized agriculture, with the money that is there within the Agri-CETA, within the UIF, within the NSF, within all of those institutions, with that money, and if we leverage that money on the one side, if you leverage the specialist knowledge on the other side, and government can provide the vehicle, right, we can really take agriculture and the transformation initiatives that are currently happening within the various commodities and through the assistance of the agribusinesses. Do you realize the kind of work that the Humansdorp Co-op, that ZZ2, and all of the other big farmers are currently doing in the South Africa space, agriculture space? It's significant. All that we need is one plan, group of specialists, almost like a war room, and we can turn the fortunes of agriculture in the favor of all of our farmers, black and white. But we need a political leader and a political party that can bring all these players together, create win-win partnerships. And to a large extent, we can double our efforts and make a success of it. But we must guard against all kinds of generalizations and frivolous statements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman in the back row.
The name is Farid. First and foremost, I just want to acknowledge Rolf. I think you've hit the nail on the head. You're spot on in terms of positioning the debate. This question is actually more for Mr. Mbeki. Mr. Mbeki, it seems we all continuously gravitate towards positioning this argument in the context of this is a political ruse or a disguise to win voters back. It can be a fallacy, a lie in your estimation. Would you then acknowledge, apart from that, if we had to agree with you, that we really have an issue with land dispossession, that people need access to land, not only in the context of historical dispossession, but also in the context of the continuous growth of the gap between rich and poor. People want access to land. We can't seem to acknowledge the fact that these land invasion aspects are growing on a day-to-day basis and then calling it a ruse. I think I totally disagree with you.
Thank you for that. A lady in the middle.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Tsakani Ngomane. I'm with the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in the Presidency. And thank you for sharing the input by the panel. I just want to say that just for us to be very realistic in dealing with the issues, you know, some of the figures that you're citing, whether it's the 4,000, 4,900 farms that are in the hands of the state, whether it's a 0.2% budget allocation for restitution, some of those figures you get from our databases. So we're aware of that. But the reality is what Mr. Mayor has raised to the panel, and I want to commend him for that. that inequality in South Africa is a real problem. We cannot just overlook it. It exists. I personally come from a rural community in Bushbuck Ridge. When people hear of a meeting on restitution, you know how people will wake up early hours of the morning just to be in line for that process. So that whole issue around correcting the imbalances, the wrongs that have been done in the past, it's a sincere issue. Also, when you go meet with farmers in a Pakistan discussion, and you get the excitement, how they want to embrace this opportunity to participate in driving the food agenda of the country, you understand the realities on the past. So I think this, we need to embrace the opportunity created by the decision of the ruling party and parliament for us to really engage on this land matter, because it's not going to go away, and be really hands-on about it. So the inequality gap is real. In all the proposed solutions that the facilitator called the august members of the panel to put forward, I had no mention of what the commercial sector commits to doing in that process. I listed all of them, and it's important for all of us to engage in this discussion. It's not, when we say the land that is newly acquired is not utilized, it's not only because of lack of skill and access to resources and all that, but what is it that we need to do as a collective to ensure that everybody contributes, is able to utilize that land, okay? So I'm just calling for everybody to embrace this as an opportunity and to deal with inequality issues as a real problem facing the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a question in the front. Just waiting for a mic. Right, please go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Klaus Eckstein. I'm from Bayer. The first point I would like to make is coming back to agriculture. South Africa is a country where we have agricultural limitations on climate. We're talking about water scarcity. We're talking about the need to compete with countries around the world that are much better equipped with managing agriculture profitably and sustainably. We need to accept this. On the other side, and everybody agrees, South Africa needs to transform. And the only thing that counts is success, and to talk about the success and then have scalability to elevate it to the next level. My question on this regards is, what I'm really missing is mutual purpose. I think we have heard it just now. If we could sit around the table and say, what is that single factor we all can say yes, where we from an industry point of view, from a governmental point of view, from a farming community point of view, say, yes, this is where we want to work. Can it be a sustainable and profitable production of food into this country? We're talking about 55 million people. We're talking about people that are hungry each and every day in our country. And we need to do something about that quickly. And we have the best heads around in this room here today. So let's ask the question, is it sustainability of food supply, and this in a sustainable and profitable way? Because we can talk about this in a transformational requirement of South Africa, then we can quickly find the answer and say, let's put our resources together and let's do something about it. But the question is, what is the mutual purpose?
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you to those questions. Who'd like to pick up some of the comments? Tara and then John.
Look, I'd like to take up one issue. You know, this tendency to say, what is this one thing that we can do to solve this process? I think it's a very unrealistic thing. Let's think a little bit about it. To create this inequality that is there in this country, how long did it take? If you just take the white section of the population, from 1948, when the National Party came to power, it collected all the white children and put them in the schools and all of that and trained them. When we grew up, there used to be what used to be called hobos. white people who were so poor, it was called the poor white problem, who ate also out of the rubbish bins and so on. In about 2 generations, they disappeared. Many of us could not, well, we were just youngsters. We couldn't quite understand, but what happened to the hobos and so on? But you see, they had disappeared into the young ones were put in the schools, so they didn't grow up just on welfare and go out to the streets to add to those who had been there. The old people who were not, they were put in the lifts of government. Some of them were handwires. You know, the guys that would stand there to show the engineer how to connect the trains and the trucks. And what these guys did is that with grants, they made them do all these little pieces and pieces of jobs, but gave them money so that they earned their income, so that dependency did not multiply itself. But when you look down the line to 70s, 74 or something, you could not see a hobo anywhere. I want us to eliminate this poverty in Diepsloot, in Khayelitsha, and all of those places. We need a program of education. We must take the children out of each and every squatter or township and so on, put them in the schools, and ensure that by the time they are 15 or 17, they can do something for themselves. That's going to take time. It's going to take from when you get a government that's going to do that. And 15 years down the line, the first classes will come out qualified with some profession, carpenter, bricklayer, or whatever else they can do. Time. Why at CODESA we said that we adopt this constitution in order to heal the divisions of the past, in order to uplift the lives of everybody, in order to ensure that we release the potential of every individual. We understood that we needed education programs. It was going to take us some amount of time to get there. Now, when I was saying Gupta, people laughed. But if you think about it, just before we were kicked out with Mbeki as our president and so on, we had reduced the national debt significantly. On the eve when we had now the money that could have been devoted in ever bigger amounts to education, to training, to housing, then that was taken away and it collapsed and so on. Even now, to turn this thing around, we will still need some amount of time. Indeed, we will probably have to go, in some cases, we'll have to go to companies and say to them, may we add a certain amount of special tax to fund education? Because we must transform the human resource element. If we want to transform society, we must transform the human element, resource element, because if we don't make our people agents of transformation, we will not transform this society.
So I heard from two of the questioners two particular things. The one is that we haven't got onto the ground of understanding what is already being done and how productive it is, which, as I read what was said, is this is going to take us a long way if we bring it to life, if we execute it. And the other is, have we really taken into account the question of dispossession? I'm coming to those two. So, Rolf and then John, do you want to comment?
I would like to say to Christo, you know, I think congratulations to everything that is happening in the agricultural commercial sectors or commodity-based organizations. I think it's fantastic work that's being done. The problem is you're not communicating sufficiently about it. The fact that it's not on the agenda here this afternoon for the discussion shows that. And I think Agri-SA and other commodity organizations should do far more about communicating what good work is being done and how it can further be promoted, also amongst an audience like this, but far wider and bigger than this. Because what is the final aim is to bring in newcomers to the industry. new farmers, emerging farmers, people who want to farm but don't know where to knock. And I think you are exposing those opportunities, but we have to do more. On the question, Nick, of a single purpose, I don't think there is one. There's not a single mutual purpose. In fact, in our discussion so far on the subject, we have identified at least 14 different issues that need to be addressed within this whole conglomeration of the land debate. And I think it's important that all 14 of those be addressed, because that could satisfy the perspectives from left to right, through the middle. And that can bring about, in fact, the mutual purpose that you're talking about. But to concentrate on one factor alone, like for instance food production, is not going to work, because you immediately exclude the understanding of the vast majority of South Africans who think about land as a way to uplift them, to bring about enrichment. And we have to understand that, otherwise we're going to miss the debate.
Lovely, John.
Yeah, I think that I think I agree with Rolf that it's very difficult to find a single purpose. But I think there are single areas we can coagulate around, and I would imagine that a consensus around which we should be coagulating is the Constitution, which is why I don't think that Section 25 should be changed. The Constitution is an area that we can all unite behind. But I think that there is one thing that can almost immediately start to address the problems not only in the agricultural sector, but in many other. Rolf spoke about 5, and all of them, as he rattled them off, are beset by incoherence in them. So, I think that if we can bring some coherence about where we're going to, where government's heading, the general direction, I think we'd start to get a better understanding about how we then can all fit in whatever various roles we play, where we're going. But, if one day we're marching to Berlin, and 2 days later you get another dispatch that will march you to Paris now, it's very difficult to marshal resources around that mission. So I think that the sooner that we have coherence about what is the plan of government, where we're heading with agriculture, you can't have food production and a stable economy with expropriation without compensation. The two are mutually exclusive, and international examples show that. You can't have a flourishing tourism industry with archaic, draconian visa regulations. And so what we need to be doing is coagulating around that consensus. I want to just say, I said at the beginning of my comments that nobody in this room can say that there's not been dispossession, and there's not deep inequality that still exists in South Africa. There is. There's spatial inequality, there's income inequality. It besets nearly every aspect of South African lives, and it is a product of our past. But the truth of the matter is we can sit around here, this table, all day. We're not going to make a better yesterday. We've got to obsess about how we make a better tomorrow. And we've got to be proactive about the type of policies we can put in place to address proactively inequality. And so the questions we need to be asking is, why after 2 decades is the income inequality widening? Why is inequality widening and not getting better? And I would say to you, it's a failure of policy. It's a failure of legislation to do its work. And I think it's an indictment on both Parliament and government departments like DPME, that it takes something like the high-level panel report to expose the shortcomings in the legislative and policy space. If the DPME have got these figures and they've had them and this is their origination, then you've got to ask yourself the question, well, why aren't these being put before committees? Why aren't they informing legislation? Why aren't they informing policy approaches for us going forward? So we need to obsess about using that information and bridging this inequality that exists. Because where I disagree with Rolf, I think that there is a consensual middle, and it's reflected in the elections, because overwhelmingly South Africans vote for centrist parties, either centre-right, centre-left, and that's reflected the two largest parties in the country, the ANC and the EFF. The radical fringes on both the right and the left never break the 10% mark. And I think this was evident in the first expropriation debate we had in Parliament, where people like Jeremy Cronin and the ANC rejected the ANC's motion, the EFF motion, on expropriation without compensation. And I was proud of that day because it showed there was a rational centre that was holding and resisting the wrenching from the left and the right. And unfortunately, the ANC's conference has turned that consensus on its head, where you now have the situation where it's barely 8 months later since that routing of that motion in Parliament, there's a complete volte-face, and the ANC are supporting the EFF's motion on expropriation without compensation.
Thank you, John. Maletsi.
Well, I was asked a question by a person at the back, and I would like him to repeat the question. But before you repeat the question, I want to respond to the speaker from Agri-SA. He accused us on the panel of being frivolous and of talking generalities. Now, I don't agree with that there is anybody who's talking generalities in the panel. We know a lot about agriculture. You may think we don't, but we do. Now, I don't understand what you mean about frivolities and generalities. Maybe he could explain a little bit more. On the question of inequality, I think we in South Africa think inequality was invented by the National Party in 1948. I was on Power FM about a month ago discussing about how my ancestors lost their land to the Zulus. The Zulu army dispossessed us of our land, which is why we ended up in the Eastern Cape. Mzilikazi went to Zimbabwe and dispossessed the Shona people of their land. Now, we talk as if inequality is a new thing invented in South Africa. I was in England over Easter. 70% of the land in England is owned by the Normans who conquered England in 1066. They still own 60% of the land in England. Did it stop the English inventing the Industrial Revolution? It didn't. So I offered to Power FM to run a series with them on what capitalism is. Because we South Africans don't seem to understand what capitalism is, how it works, what it is about. General Motors is not owned by the Americans, it's owned by a few capitalists. Anglo-American Corporation of South Africa is not owned by white South Africans, it's owned by a few shareholders. So if we don't understand what the capitalist system is, then let's start there. Let's start and discuss what is the capitalist system, how does it achieve progress, how does it not achieve progress, so that we understand the society that we are living in.
Can you briefly restate your question? It was it was about dispossession, right? Yeah. So the question was really about the current realities of dispossession. The current realities of dispossession, and they're not being dealt with, as I understood your question.
There are 37,000 farmers in South Africa. I am one of them because I own 3 farms. Now, one day I asked one of these people who are counting black economic empowerment and so on. So I asked him, he was telling me that, there's so many percentage of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is owned by whites, and some 3 or 4% is owned by blacks. So I asked him, and he's my brother-in-law. He's an expert. He's even written a book on the subject. So I told him my money is managed by Rand Merchant Bank Asset Management. Have you included it in this equation of yours of how much of the Joburg Stock Exchange is owned by blacks? My money that is managed by Rand Merchant Bank is invested in the Joburg Stock Exchange. When I asked him, he said it's not included. So I then said, if you don't include me, how many other black people whose money is managed by RMB or some other Sanlam asset management are excluded? And in the meantime, you are running this propaganda machine that the black people don't own any assets in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange.
I get that. But just to come back to you at the back and say, is it true to say 60% of young black men in urban areas are unemployed? And the answer is, of course it's true. And this is a structural feature of our politics. And it's a source of much energy. And as we said earlier, we are heading into an election in which parties are going to persuade voters that these realities are the core realities. That, I think, is the gist of your comment. So let's take another round. And I see one, I see two, and some people are scratching their heads. Any more? A third one? Three. So go ahead. 1, 2, and 3.
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah, just to hone in on the question about capitalism and how it really works. As far as I can tell, let's just go back a few years to a couple of weeks after Black First, Land First was first a thing. Thomas Piketty came, world famous economist, came to speak to deliver the Nelson Mandela lecture. And that's the first time that I saw a major South African platform sort of put the issue of inequality and the issue of land next to each other. And he encouraged violence. He encouraged expropriation without compensation. And between then and now, it's been quite hard for me to find other sort of world-renowned economists or thinkers who've thought along similar lines. One of the things that he didn't point out in his speech, but that you can find in his data, is that the ratio of capital to GDP, the ratio of how much wealth there is in the country to how much do we make every year, is about 2 to 1. Germany, it's about 4.5 to 1, which is extraordinarily low for Europe. France, it's like 6. The UK, America, it's 7 to 1. Japan, it's 8 to 1. In a world where it takes capital to make work productive, if you've got a ratio of 2 to 1, that means there's very little capital, which means it's hard for people to find work. So there's another economist who was mentioned in the previous discussion here, who before Piketty, I think, was seen as the world's greatest economist. That's how Bill Clinton described him, Hernando de Soto. And he wasn't so interested in inequality. He was interested in growth, in turning dead capital alive, in turning poor people who want to be entrepreneurs into entrepreneurs by giving them title deed, by making that transparent and affordable. As far as I can tell, there's an academic study by very liberal thinkers who say that there are 23.5 million South Africans who sleep on land that they don't own because the state owns it. Those are entrepreneurs that could be making something out of their lives. I've spoken to dozens of them in KZN, in Limpopo, a stone's throw away from here, and they are blocked by red tape. They're blocked by a state that's holding on to that stuff. And yes, it's part of the inequality story, but really what it's part of is the growth story. The fact that South Africa should be growing, given where we are, much faster than we are. And it seems that really the problem is that we don't trust our poor capitalists, the guys who have very little and want to turn that into more. So the EFF don't trust them. They think no one should own their own land. You should only trust the state. Half of the ANC, the Nkosazana and Dlamini Zuma, half maybe more, maybe less, seem to think along the same lines. I'm amazed and very heartened to see the leader of COPE and the whip of the DA here. You guys seem to be thinking on different lines. I want to know what you guys plan on doing to show that you really do trust poor South Africans who are capitalists, who think that they could make their lives better if they were just given the chance. Because it seems to me that they've been held back and surely should feel frustrated by the government they've got. I mean, one more statistic, the Institute for Race Relations has been doing surveys on this for decades. About 1% of South Africans apparently think that land reform is a crucial issue. Most of them think jobs, 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 and a stable economic environment. Mark Data did the largest scientific study that I could come across on political issues last year, and they found that across all races they thought radical economic transformation was a bad idea. And here was what really blew my hair back, and I think speaks to Mr. Mbeki's point. A lot of poor black South Africans are far more economically literate than they're given credit for. Amongst poor black South Africans, there was some of the highest opposition to radical economic transformation because it was seen as a way for corrupt politicians to get away with murder. They wanted better, more stable structures for small capitalists, middle-sized capitalists, and large capitalists to take what they've got and make more out of it. How can you show those South Africans that they can trust you not to patronize them, not to talk down to them, not to speak about handouts, but to say, listen, if you think you can back yourself, we want to put a fair structure in place that allows you to get ahead if you've got what it takes.
Lovely, thank you. Lady behind you.
Hi, my name is Richard Cricker. I'm from the Western Cape. I was just thinking on a lighter note, Terrace, you asked where the hobos are. When I stop at a robot in the metropole, I see black entrepreneurs running around the robots and the white guys standing with signs. And that speaks to the entrepreneurial spirit of black people in this country, and I just want to make that point. As a commodity grouping, and the commodity groupings in South Africa have done a phenomenal work in what they've done. You've heard it from Christo. These programs have all given a phenomenal return in the amount of money that's been invested in them. What we're lacking in this country is political will and this racial divide that's been pushed forward by the ruling party at the moment. We need trust from the government and we need cooperation. These programs have all been proven to be very successful, but are unfortunately underfunded. And that needs to be rectified. The quickest way to move this forward is to start funding the commodity houses programs and moving forward on those programs. There's a lot of solutions that have been thrown out here now. They have been proven to be successful and are delivering the results that government wants. There are government officials that do know about the program, but because they're seen as white programs, they're frowned upon and not part of what they plan. And that needs to change. The trust and the divide between the ruling party, commercial agriculture, and people of different ethnic groups, color, etc., needs to change in this country for us to go forward.
Thanks for the comment. Was there a third? There we go.
Hello, my name is Heather Dugmore and I'm a journalist and a cattle farmer. So what I wanted to say is while we're doing all the research on what needs to be happening with land reform, the farms, I think what also needs to be happening is, let me give you an example. I attended the the Eastern Cape Communal Wool Farmers Annual Conference. These are some of the most amazing wool farmers, one of them winning the top BKB wool prize. And he told me that for years and years and years, he has tried and tried and tried to apply for a farm. He's one of many who are very, very capable, good farmers who submit, and the forms are substantial because this isn't the first time that I've also assisted someone that we work with in filling out forms, and many people who fill out these forms are not literate people. They're very bright people, but they're not literate necessarily. And they want CVs, and they want, you know, obviously you've got to have your cattle stamp and your this and your that. It's a wad of documents like this. You submit them, and where they go, I have no idea. But someone needs to, because a person that we work with helped develop a farm and didn't even get a show in its redistribution in the New Bethesda area. When I phoned to give him the phone to ask what had happened to his application, all I got is, why am I phoning? And I said, well, here's the man. He doesn't have access to email, so I merely used my email. It's his forms, not my forms. So something has to be looked at, because there's a lot of rot and partisanship at that level, where a lot of very, very good farmers have put in their applications and nothing at all has happened there. So, and then also I must say I agree with the comment that Agri-SA does need far, far better journalism getting out there. I mean, Milk SA is supporting great new farmer empowerment. There's so much that is good that's happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, so the two parties that are here, any comments to the first question about theories of capitalism and economic development? John.
Well, I mean, I think it's no secret. I mean, our party follows the Hernando de Soto model, and that's why we obsess about title, and that's why in DA-run metropolitan areas and DA-run provinces, we are ensuring and rolling out a title deed redistribution program second to none, the likes of which and the pace of which can't be matched by any other area in the country. Is it fast enough? Absolutely not. Do we have a lot more to do? Absolutely. But are we far more along in terms of giving title to individuals for precisely the reasons that De Soto points out, that they then become a tangible asset. You give somebody, as I said earlier, a stake in the country, but also a stake in the economy and an asset against which they can leverage their future. But there exists another inequality in South Africa which very few people want to talk about because it's very uncomfortable. And somebody did touch on it earlier. But it's in, when we deal with inequality. And that's this complete twilight zone, constitutional twilight zone that besets our rural areas. And the high-level panel report and the expose on this is shocking, and it should be something that's worrying every South African, that there exist large swathes of South Africa where the Constitution doesn't apply, and people are beholden to their rights through a local chieftain or a tribal trust area. And if you displease them, or things don't go your way, or you're a widow whose husband passed away, your rights are gone, and you're pushed off. And there's a shopping centre that's developed. Residents in that report describe arriving home from work, and their houses are being bulldozed to make way for a filling station. And these are the types of stories that exist, and this inequality that exists in that urban-rural divide, where people 24 years on are still living outside of a constitutional order. And that can't be right in South Africa. So our model is to absolutely obsess about giving people title, whether it's an RDP house or whether it's a land reform farm in the Western Cape, and then to follow up on the support, which is why the figures in terms of sustainability and viability are so much higher, because you've got to be able to give support to those emerging farmers. And I want to say here, and I think that the Agri-SA representative makes a point, that I think actually in the final analysis, the commercial agriculture and the unions and the commodity organizations are doing far more than government does on an annual basis to empower and make viable emerging black farmers. And I think they need to be given more credit for that, and instead of beaten over the head all the time by government as the enemy. So I think South Africans want to be free agents and own their own properties. And the more we can do that, I think the better our economy will be. My final point, you spoke about statistics, and I think you just need to look at the world's figures. Those countries which have the highest GDP, have the lowest infant mortality rate, and have the lowest incidence of poverty are in fact are those that have got the strongest property rights. And if you go down the scale, those countries that have insecure property rights are generally poor, generally have very high infant mortality rates, and have a far higher incidence of poverty. And so that's why another reason why we don't need to unstitch this property rights clause in South Africa, because once you open that door, it's going to unleash a Pandora's box of consequences, which I don't think many people in South Africa have thought through clearly enough. Thanks.
Before I give the panel the last word, I'm going to ask Rolf Meyer. You've spent much time in government, and you played an important role in home affairs of reform. The kind of comment that was made about the problems of paperwork, do you think this is primarily political, or is it primarily administrative?
I was going to add something to this.
Sure, go ahead, and then I'll come through.
I'm sorry to take it back.
That's right.
My dear friends, when we lived under apartheid, we were not allowed, the black sections of the population were not allowed to own homes or build homes in what you call urban South Africa. A consequence of which they were working in this economy, always taking the money out to the so-called Bantustan areas. They've built houses there, some of them mansions, worth up to 8 million and so on and so on. They still have not been given title to those houses. That is money that once we did away with the Bantustans, should have been allowed to come back into the mainstream economy of the country. So critical to give title to all the people with huge houses in Kwaqo, in Hampahlele, in Gazankulu, their lot, so that those people or their children can take that money, those title deeds, go to a bank, any city, and offer it as a collateral and start their businesses, finance their cousins and aunts and all of that. That money is sitting there, dirt. This government has not acted on giving them title. They are now talking of taking the trust land of Ngonyama trust land. Why do you want to take that? That is the little piece of land that colonial conquest did not take away from Amazulu. Leave it to the royal house. Give them title. Let them Ngonyama. You can advise him and he can decide how to do it. Let him give a title to all of the households that are on that land. Let them get experts to study that terrain and tell them whether they can grow sugarcane or apples or whatever on the mountain sides of that. And huge investments must arise from there. And they can create trust funds, like the Ngonyama Trust Fund can create a trust fund and finance further younger South Africans who are on those territories, etc., etc. This can bring such huge relief. It would be unbelievable. The royal houses, by the way, are not only peculiar to us. There's royal houses in Britain. There's royal houses among the Dutch, and so on. And before conquest, in fact, even when we were conquered, many of those who were sent abroad for study by the people from here, they were sent by the royal houses. Royal houses, because they lead these people, they can make out of that trust funds, they can educate, they can prepare their young people who will become entrepreneurs, etc. I do not believe that you can take a lot of money from Mr. Binedell and give it to my son, and therefore my son will be as rich as him. Because my father told me years ago, if you don't know how to make money, you cannot look after money. We must educate, we must train. Please, we must educate and train. Because when we train and educate our children, they can always generate for themselves that which they need, and they can do this. So here in the urban centers, the state has been given power, in fact, which has been used and abused. Why the government now and then gives some money? They give Tandimudise a farm of 4.1 million rand. It's the running commercial enterprise. She doesn't know how to run this thing. She leaves it there and goes to sit there and chair the Council of Provinces. Pigs die, chickens die, milk is not there, cattle are not milked, and so on. And ultimately, pigs eat the dead pigs and so on. That farm is finished. Now, it is not how we are going to do it. To say, no, I don't want this thing, the creation that I must just give people land, just give them some land. There has to be a systematic certainty that they will work and build and go. Because if money is not used, it dies. It's something that I've learned over time. Of course, Mr. Mbeki is right that we must educate children about how capitalism works. The lesson that was given by Mr. Mikoba in David Copperfield, and he says to David Copperfield, my dear David, if your income is £1 and your expenditure is more than the £1, the result is misery. but if you get £1 and your expenditure is 19 shillings and that, then of course the result is happiness. We must teach the children that. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Rolf.
Nick is referring to the question of producing the required results by government, state departments, like the one that the lady has referred to in terms of her experience for the poor man who tried to get his message across. Some 10 years ago, I was part of a project that helped the Department of Home Affairs to do a turnaround. You might recall in the early part of this century, the process of getting an ID document or a passport at Home Affairs was a very slow one. It took, on average, at that stage, 135 days to get an ID from time of application, on average. Some actually extended that average. Then we went in and we helped the back office, the production phase of that process at Home Affairs. And in the end, the time was reduced to 27 days for the same document, by the same people, by the way. There was not a single staff member laid off in the department. And I think that proves that it can be done. And while we have the representative here from the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation, I think this is the kind of thing that we must inspire the state to look at all departments on an ongoing basis. Some departments are excellent in their production of what they're required to, and others are failing. And this is the typical example. And then, unfortunately, there's also the other aspect of state delivery of services, and that is genuine rompslomp. Dis die Afrikaanse woord wat dit die beste beskryf. Red tape. But it's rompslomp. It tells actually what it means. It goes through papers as is required, and there's no result at the end of the day in terms of tangible results for the people that are requiring the services. And much of that is also what we are observing in local governments at the moment. It's of the subject at the moment that we are discussing, but the protests that are coming at local level is coming from exactly that weakness in producing service results. So
your answer is it's primarily administrative. Maletsi's comment earlier was it's primarily political. Let's go around the panel and give you one last comment if you would like. Cully, is there one last thought?
It's of course political because the inefficiencies is created by cadre deployment, and you have people being employment not because of their ability but because of their political party links. Just a broad statement on what I think the solution is. We spoke about education, title deeds, respect for property rights, but I think there's something else I didn't mention. I think there should be a renewal of trust. It seems like the last 10 years a lot of damage was done in our society. There are many angry people, and in fact I must say I'm sometimes angry as well, because you don't want to be made a political scapegoat for everything that is going wrong in the country. And the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor said, you don't get one political solution and then just leave it. It has to be renewed from time to time. And I think there's a need for a renewal of trust, but that of course you need a political will from government.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I think that there's lots to be cross and negative and angry about in South Africa today, but I think there's lots to be really excited and optimistic about, and I don't think any of us would be in the positions we are today if we didn't actually inherently believe it. But it's going to require the best of all of us to be brought to the table in whatever shape or form our contribution can be, and to do that. And I mean, I remember the words Robert Kennedy said at the University of Cape Town. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or strikes out for an injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And joining each other from different points of energy, it forms a wave that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression. And so I think the challenge for each of us is to become a ripple of hope, whether we're in politics, whether we're in agriculture, whether we're in academia, or in business, to be that ripple of hope in our sphere of influence, to build a better South Africa. But it's going to mean we've got to work together. There's one more thing that unites us. We may be different horses, different color horses, as Mr. Lecorte said, but we're all horses. And that's that we all occupy this really awesome piece of rock on the southernmost tip of this mighty continent. And it's going to sink or swim. It's going to be together. There's not certain of us are going to be saved and some of us that are going to sink. And so I think each of us has a responsibility to play our part in really making this the country that we know it can be and the success that we know our future can be.
Thank you. Tara.
Well, we believe that the future of South Africa lies in all of us breaking out of our little corners where we are seated. President Mandela, in his last, I think it was the last joint sitting, when he told all of us that there are good men and good women in each and every one of the political parties, and he named them, ANC, National Party, etc. But then he also told us there are evil men and evil women in the ANC, in the National Party, in the IFP, the whole lot. And then he said to us, the secret confronting us as a nation is to aggregate the good men and women on one side so that they lead the nation into the future. That is the thing we need to do. It cannot be some little party there and that other party there from this tribe and that and so on. It's got to be who are the good men and women in this nation who can be voted for by the electorate. Put them in power. Hold them accountable. We must also change the Electoral Act, because this Electoral Act has put political power in the hands of some political party or the other. And if you cannot hold any individual accountable, and that thing should long have been changed. When the people have power, they put you there. And if you mess up, they must be able to remove you. That is not existing at the moment. We must ask for permission, I don't know, donkey years, whether we must remove Zuma or remove whoever or Mahuma Pilu or something. Political power must go back into the hands of the people. And the people must decide, we want so-and-so to lead, and when that person fails, please recall him. They must have that power. Get rid of that person. Bring a better man or woman on. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruth.
Well, sometimes we get people elected that are not so good. And then we have to rely on something else, and I think that is the Constitution. And that has been proven in the last 9 years in particular in our situation. It was the Constitution that actually saved the country for us. And of course the Constitutional Court. And I think there is a change. I mean, Kali, I can't recall that you've approached the Constitutional Court this year yet with a new case. And that proves the point. That proves the point.
Only May.
That that something has changed. And I think there's more hope. I would agree with John in that regard. I think there's more hope. There's a window of opportunity, not only for agriculture, I think generally for the country. And we all have to make our contribution, but in the end, I think the one thing that we can rely on is the Constitution.
Well, let's see.
Okay, well, we're here as the panelists. You're here for your agricultural business, but as the panelists, we're here because the ANC passed the resolution on expropriation of land without compensation, which is supported by the EFF. We have two political parties here. This is a political fight that they must lead to defend the Constitution, the Clause 25, but they can't fight it on their own. They must go to the population at large. They must go to the agricultural organizations. They must go to the trade unions and to the churches to mobilize against. We have to focus. We have to focus on the issue at hand. We can't be hitting out in all directions and taking the eye off the ball, which is the expropriation of land without compensation and the attack on the white population and using it as a scapegoat for inequality, for South Africa's many, many problems. That, in my view, is what I appeal to the political parties to do. They must provide leadership, but they can't talk about a multiplicity of issues because then we don't know where we are. If we are fighting this land expropriation, then they must go up and down the country and focus on fighting that issue, mobilize the farm workers who are going to be the first casualties. It's not as if this didn't happen in other countries. It has happened in many, many countries. Who are the victims of Venezuela's misguided economic policy? It's the poor Venezuelans. You see them on television trying to shop in neighboring countries, women going to give birth in Colombia instead of their own countries with the mayhem that has been caused by the Chavez regime. Chavez is supported by EFF in this country. That's where they got the red beret from Chavez. So we have to focus on the issue but we have to mobilize everybody.
Lovely, thank you. So they're big stakes. They're present. They're in the room. The tensions are in the room. We're focusing on them now for very clear reasons, and we will focus on them in the next year as they take political shape. What I've learned in studying other emerging countries like South Africa is that politics drives economics, and good politics makes good economics, and bad politics makes bad economics. And so we have none but ourselves to blame as citizens, as owners of land, as workers, unless we become active citizens. Someone once said to me when I was living in the USA in the 80s, when South Africa was really on the boil, he said, it sounds like your country is a large circle of people, with each one pointing a finger into the back of the person in front of them, unaware there's someone pointing a finger in their backs. So let me end by thanking you for coming and saying we need each other. As I've got a bit more familiar with the scale and skill and scope of agriculture in this country, I have to say we have a tremendous capacity. Those who've said that this afternoon are right. But it would be a tragedy if we don't all act together to make the calculation of our common interests. We do have a constitution, but a society is not a constitution unless people take action around it. Constructive, democratic, positive action. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I'd like to thank the panel. Thank you.